across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and as you might imagine, we're going to cover a lot of different topics fairly quickly because in the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with another one of our experts from Energy and really looking at how some of these votes in some of these key midterm elections are affecting the ability of the United States to produce enough energy, and that has always been an issue, especially at a time when many of you are looking for air conditioning, and at the time when we're talking about building data. When we see some of these ads, we wonder if some of the claims by candidates are actually true. He's going to get into this whole idea that, well, yes, I said a lot of really dumb things just even a year or two ago, but that was ancient history, and you're just cherry picking a few of my comments. No, take people seriously, not only in what they say, but in what they do. So it's going to be quite a time with him. And I might just mention that our Friday weekend edition will be with Holly Randall and with Liberty McCarter. We've already put together the articles for that. That's going to be a really good program. And so I hope you'll be with us today, and especially you'll be with us tomorrow. But it is back to school, and I've got a back to school piece tomorrow by Cal Thomas. This one is by John Stossel. And he brings it up because let's get back to Woke 1.0, Woke 2.0. Back when Woke was really taking off, the argument is that the SAT tests were actually racist, and were actually the creators were avowed eugenicists. And so John Stossel did a piece back when that was happening and has done a new one. And this, which is our first article for you to find, I don't think it's been posted yet, but it'll be up there shortly, is again a reminder of some of the insanity that took place, because the argument at the time is that we should not have these standardized tests, and one of the arguments is they must be racist because African American students don't do so well. But John Stossel reminds us in the newest one, and even goes back to the previous time in which that was taking place, that after these colleges stopped requiring the test for admissions, it actually was hurting what you might refer to as the underrepresented groups, because there is some pretty strong evidence from the College Board itself that students that maybe had a C grade in high school but had good SAT scores end up doing better in college than A students who had lower SAT scores. And so it's one of the very few ways that you could overcome a bad school, or even overcome some of the problems in terms of discipline and grading that might have taken place in some of the substandard schools. I'm going to get into that in just a minute, because I've also got a piece by our good friend Larry Sand, Escaping the Educational Industrial Complex. But nevertheless, this piece, I think, reminds us that the more we can perhaps find the best possible students, the better off they're going to be. And he engages in the video, and this goes back and forth in the article we've posted with the executive director of Fair Test, who says, well, yeah, sometimes we do get an occasional example of a Latino immigrant who did poorly in high school, but actually because he does or she does well on the test, did better in college, and points out that that's not the exception. There are some great rules to that as well. Be fine. Well, again, that's where Riley says, no, I'm African American. What we're doing here is setting up some of these students to fail. He says, I see no progress in getting a bunch of black kids, he's African American, I might add, admitted to MIT, and then having them flunk out or struggle when they don't need to be struggling, because they could be going to another school and doing quite well and actually graduate. So again, I know there was a lot of hue and cry and criticism of, indeed, the SAT tests. And there was a time when it was hard to find a major university that was still taking seriously the SAT test. As I look down now, I think I looked at all the Ivy League schools. They all now are going back to the SAT test. So we went through a little about that wokeness, which is something that, again, our latest booklet that's coming out to you on the woke issue, this one's on woke Christianity, is certainly something we will continue to pay attention to. But if nothing else, this piece by John Stossel reminds us that there was a time in which almost no one in the educational establishment would even want to touch things like the SAT and the ACT tests, but those tend to provide at least another objective valuation of a student. And again, test scores are one indicator. Scores and grades in high school are another, and even maybe in some cases schools that require you to write an essay or to show some of the other kind of extracurricular activity you're involved with. All of that matters, and as kids are heading off to school, we'll come back and talk about the educational industrial complex, but also as a lot of young people are heading now to campus, we can see that many of them now have found their way to that campus, not only because of the grades that they received in high school, but also the tests that they took, whether the ACT or the SAT. And of course, those tests are still used in large part to determine, for example, are you going to go to law school, the LSAT? Are you going to go to graduate school, the graduate record exam? So these are some tests that maybe for a while fell out of favor. I think they're back again, and it illustrates that maybe some aspect of wokeness have begun to fade into the background. And frankly, I think that's good news. We come back, though, let's talk about school just a bit longer. Larry Sand's piece is very good, and it's our second article on our website at pointofview.net. Stay tuned. I'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Washington, D.C. has two different types of museums, the Smithsonian Museum and the Museum of the Bible. I like both museums, but the first one is looking more like an instrument of wokeism and left-wing culture. Last year, President Trump issued an executive order dedicated to restoring truth and sanity to American history. This year, the White House Domestic Policy Council issued a 162-page report on the National Museum of American History. The director appeared before Congress to respond to the report. Now, you might have seen how the representative, Brandon Gill, asked the director if she thought politeness was a sign of white supremacy, since that is stated in the Smithsonian material. She also has been promoting a different role for the museum. She wants to connect research and scholarship to activism and advocacy. She sees their programs and displays as a prime tool of social justice. The Smithsonian Museum could learn something from the Museum of the Bible, even though it is not a taxpayer-funded government museum. It begins with some foundational principles, namely that the Bible is transcendent truth. It illustrates how the Bible shaped Western culture. By contrast, the Smithsonian attempts to reinterpret history through the latest cultural and philosophical fads. Perhaps the greatest failing of the Smithsonian isn't what is said, but what is left out. A recent white paper on the museum reported that there is no major exhibit dedicated to America's founding era, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, other founding fathers, the Continental Congress, the Pilgrims, and the Puritans. The American people deserve better. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's talk about education for just a few minutes. And Larry Sand's been on the program with us before. Individual that has really been kind of watching what is happening in the educational establishment. And he talks about the fact that the latest survey, this comes from Ed Choice, Schooling in America, which again, you can recognize that they are going to point in one direction, found, this most recent survey found that 56% of parents, in other words, a majority of parents believe that K through 12 education is on the wrong track. Indeed, he says too many traditional American public schools are failing to fulfill that role. So that's the perception of the parents. What are the facts? Well, it turns out that we do have a report card, and frankly, it's not the report card many of us would like to have shown our parents. It's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. It's oftentimes referred to as the nation's report card. And they found that, for example, 12th grade students, those would be seniors in high school, scored their lowest of reading and math in decades. That's not good news. Now, you could say part of that has to do with the pandemic and the lockdown. I'm sure that it does. But also you have to say, what is going on in the schools when you would think by now we could recover from some of that? But again, let's go back to the basics. In math, 45%, almost a majority of high school seniors scored below basic in math. Okay? That's significant. They can't just do basic math. Have you ever been to a fast food where the electricity is down and they're supposed to make change? I can see some of you rolling your eyes right now. You know exactly what we're talking about here as well. This is the lowest rate since 2005. Okay, that's math. What about reading? Well, a third, 32%, scored below basic, the lowest level since we've ever done the testing. That is, I think, disturbing. So you may say, well, okay, those are some that were affected in one way by the pandemic and the lockdown. Let's look down and who's coming down the pipeline. Well, they also do an evaluation of 8th graders. Well, 8th graders, 38% scored below basic in science, meaning they couldn't recognize basic facts, such as the fact that, I don't know, plants need sunlight to grow. What are these students doing? And what are the teachers doing to come up with this? Well, Larry Sand, of course, has an idea, and that is the answer, he says, is take full control of your child's education. While this may give many parents pause, homeschooling is a deeply American tradition. Contrary to stereotypes, it's no longer a niche practice, but has an accessible, effective, and reasonable option for parents seeking greater control over their children's instruction. The National Home Education Research Institute estimates that we have more than 3.41 million students in grades K through 12 that are homeschooled right now. That's up significant, what used to be about 2.5 million. And I think many of us might know why. When we did have the pandemic and the lockdown, that's when some people started saying, what's going on? As he points out, one of the greatest benefits to the homeschool movement was the teacher union orchestrated COVID lockdowns that shuttered most of the country's public schools for a year or more, forced online learning, which first of all was a disaster in many counts, but had a silver lining. Parents saw exactly what teachers were teaching or what they weren't teaching, and many of them were not pleased. To illustrate the point, this is perhaps one of the most riveting paragraphs in his piece, and I would encourage you to read it cover to cover. But he says, one of the things that's so interesting about these teachers' unions is the teachers' union in San Francisco. And I grew up in the Bay Area, so I know this only so well. They went on strike back in February. I don't even know if I took time to mention it because it was only a 4-day strike. But nevertheless, here's the rest of it. The United Educators of San Francisco didn't just walk off the job. They emailed parents urging them to avoid at-home learning. They did so because any educational progress families might make independently would weaken the union's bargaining position. This move, he says, highlights the clash between the powerful teachers' unions and fundamental parents' rights. Did you catch that? We're going to walk off the job, so there won't be school for 4 days. Of course, they thought it was going to be longer, but, it won't be school for an indefinite period of time. But we don't want you teaching at home because then we won't be able to use that as a bargaining chip. Because if you do as well or even better teaching your kids at home during the time teachers are not in the classroom, that's going to make it hard for our bargaining position. And so he goes on, of course, talks about other things, including the idea of micro-schooling. Turns out a lot of these so-called micro-schools aren't as micro as they used to be. The median number of students in a typical micro-school was about 16. Now that figure's up to 22, and in some it's up to 100. So, again, there have been other alternatives, but the article, I think, is just a great reminder that as we are in the back-to-school mode right now, there are more choices than just sending your child or your grandchild down the street to the public school. And he goes into some depth about some aspects of why many parents are concerned and why the schools still getting record amounts of money being spent on education, nevertheless show such poor performance. But just before we take a break, one other piece that I thought would be worthwhile. This comes from Representative Mary Miller. She is a member of the House of Representatives serving in Illinois, the 15th Congressional District. And she has, I think, a good contrast. It relates to a political cartoon I saw the other day where it had a vote. One check mark was for common sense. The other was communism. And in her piece, she says, in common sense versus crazy, Democrats lose every time. And it goes on for 2 pages of crazy examples because she says we're less than 3 months from the midterm elections. And for all of the billions of dollars that would be spent trying to convince Americans otherwise, the choice facing voters is really straightforward. It is remarkably straightforward, she says. Do Americans want government guided by common sense or by crazy woke ideas that have endlessly proven to make our lives worse? And she talks about some of the examples here. You've had individuals, for example, that have said, we probably just need to get rid of some of our holidays. We have some of these individuals paddling around with people like Hassan Piker, who's notorious for his anti-American rhetoric and his infamous claim that America deserved 9/11. She talks about in Massachusetts, I was just in Massachusetts the other day, the State House, controlled by Democrats, passed Prioritizing Patient Access to Care Act, which is basically legislation that eliminates any limits on abortion, which means you could kill babies right up to birth. She talks about how the Democratic Socialists of America have a platform, and she quotes something I mentioned earlier in one of my commentaries where you had the co-chair. This is the national co-chair of the Democratic Socialist of America, Megan Romer, who actually agreed with every one of the points in the platform, which included such things as abolishing the Senate and the presidency and changing the Supreme Court and having that subject to Congress, eliminating borders, eliminating prisons, enacting mass amnesty for illegal aliens and the rest. And so, again, she points out very clearly that if you are a political party that demands the abolition of borders, prisons, and the presidency, that should be probably disqualifying enough. And then she quotes some of the pardons, one that comes under, of course, Governor Tim Walz and the Attorney General Keith Ellison in Minnesota, of an individual that was actually pled guilty for sexually abusing a girl, but was pardoned. And again, she says in Minnesota, the difference between common sense and crazy is readily apparent. And, of course, you think of Tim Walz, could have been your vice president. But speaking of the person that could have been president, Kamala Harris, like virtually every other leader in the Democratic Party, says she's ready to eliminate the Electoral College, wants to pack the Supreme Court, and a variety of other issues. As a matter of fact, it's hard to find any major leader, with the exception maybe John Fetterman, who doesn't want to bring about remarkably radical changes to our constitutional republic. So it's a very good piece, just reminding you that maybe as you go in to vote, the real question isn't Republican or Democrat or Libertarian. It may be common sense versus crazy. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about some of those issues in the midterms right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we, of course, are going to be spending more and more time talking about the midterm elections. A lot of that will even be taking place tomorrow in our Friday weekend edition. Looking forward to that with Liberty McCarter and Hallie Randall. But today, I thought we'd come back to a topic we dealt with briefly on Tuesday with a group of individuals. First of all, with those with Always On Energy. We did kind of point that out. And today, we have some links to a number of things. One, to the actual Substack that is done by the guests that we're going to be interviewing. One that takes us to the general website for Always On Energy research. And then a third one that takes you to why do blue states have high rates? And to help us understand that, she is the co-author of that Blue States High Rates issue at Always On Energy. Sarah Montalbano is an individual that has been looking at these issues, put together this 50-state index looking at U.S. electricity, affordability, energy policy. Again, you may have seen some of her articles in things like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Review, New York Post. As we've pointed out, and I think I mentioned even yesterday, she's lived both in Florida and Alaska. Right now is joining us from Alaska and looking at, of course, these very important midterm elections. So, again, Sarah, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, before we get into the election itself, let's give you all sorts of credit. And that is, I have in front of me here, and if people go to the website, pointofview.net, or they can go to bluestateshighrates.com. You don't have to remember all that. We have all the links necessary. They will see the 50 states. including, of course, where you are right now in the 50th state. And in some respects, I think they will be surprised because the mindset would be, well, I would expect it would to be probably worse in the blue states and better in the red states. And although in some ways that's generally true, there are some other factors there as well. And so it illustrates that even though we're a national program, you need to be paying attention to some of the people running for office. You need to be paying attention to what is happening in Juneau or Albany or Sacramento or Tallahassee or Springfield, wherever that might be, because in some respects it's going to have a very significant difference in what you pay for electricity and, for that matter, what you pay for gas. Tell us more.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And our Blue States High Rates project with the Institute for Energy Research, we look at 6 factors, and we talk about them all through all of the 50 states plus DC. So we talk about if your state is mandating a certain percentage of energy come from renewable sources, if how they're compensating rooftop solar, because that can become more or less expensive depending on your state. Whether you're like California or Washington, where you have a cap and trade program, or if you are putting a price on carbon dioxide. We talk about the hot topic also of this moment, which is data center consumer.
Oh, yeah.
Are your lawmakers thinking about how to do this, but also not be too unnecessarily burdensome? So do you strike the right balance there? And we also talk about your access to natural gas, as well as if your utilities are voluntarily pledging to achieve net zero. So it's a big catalog. It's fully sourced. You can track down all of the information for all of the 50 states, and we really hope that it'll be a good resource for folks.
Again, and if you scroll down, you'll see that data center issues, which we've talked about before. Of course, the various net zero pledges, natural gas, access, renewables, metering, carbon price, tax, all of those kinds of things. And these, I think, are important because, as we have pointed out, you may say, well, I don't want a data center in my backyard, but you know what? I bet you do want to have internet access. I bet you probably do want to have AI access. And a lot of people tend to just think that that energy just comes just automatically out of the sky, and we don't have to actually build plants or think about nuclear, think about retiring fossil fuel plants to be recovered with something else. And those kinds of very important questions are things we've talked about before here on Point of View, and that's in some respects why always on energy research exists, right?
That's precisely why we are here to talk about those reliable and affordable energy sources and to really dispel a lot of the myths that we think are out there in the media right now. I am sure that you've heard the claim that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy, right? Our bread and butter is really showing why on a system-wide basis that is simply not the case. It gets very expensive to run a grid on intermittent energy, even when some of these numbers look very appealing at the start. So that's a large part of why we're here, is to provide this kind of reliable, fact-based information. And again, BlueStatesHighRates.com is so rigorously sourced because we want to make sure that if you see a sentence there, you can click on the link, you can see exactly where we got it.
Well, just the other day, we had, of course, Isaac Orr on, and of course you know him because you work with him. And I think we were spending some time talking about some of the votes in a couple of key states, and we focused on Alaska and Florida, and we broadcast in both of those states. And even though Alaska and Florida are about as far apart as you can possibly imagine geographically, they both had races that had to do with the issue of energy. Since you're broadcasting right now from Alaska, tell us about the race up there and why that was significant.
Yeah, Alaska is a weird beast right now as far as elections, and I know my bailiwick here is energy, but you can't talk about Alaska's elections without noting that they are a ranked choice voting state. So their primary right now was just a pick one primary. People vote in this big jungle primary, and the top 4 vote getters are going to be going to the the general election. And so what really seems likely is you've got two Democrats right now, a gentleman known by JKT and Tom Begich on the Democrat side, and then two Republicans are also likely going to make it, Bernadette Wilson and Dave Bronson. And so what's really at stake as far as energy issues, Alaska is running out of natural gas from Cook Inlet. Production has been dropping there for quite a while, and it's really going to come to a head probably next year. And so homes are going to get more expensive to heat, and there will be a lot less natural gas to go around. And what the next governor will do is going to be, really important for if the state can get enough natural gas.
Well, again, they're talking about an LNG pipeline, a number of other things. So that just illustrates again that most of the time when people go to vote, they're voting about their pocketbook, and a big issue right now is affordability. But one aspect of that is energy. If the price of energy goes up, then, of course, the prices go up. But then if energy becomes limited, some of our listeners in other parts of the country have seen brownouts and blackouts and all sorts of other issues. So you have to, when you vote for a candidate, think of all the issues. And of course, one of those that you've been highlighting is the issue of energy. I need to come up to a break real quickly because when we come back, I want you to talk about what's going on in Florida. But I think this would be a good time for me to mention, again, some of the great resources that are available through your organization, because there are ways in which people, if they would like to know a little bit more, can actually find some of those resources. So the first button that you can click right by Sarah's picture will actually take you to Montalbano Mondays, and I believe that is where you can follow her Substack. The second one will take you to, again, Always On Energy Research, or it's aoenergy.org, and that I think will be very helpful to you. But you might, since we are a national program, I'm not going to talk about what's going on in all 50 states, focus on that last one, bluestateshighrates.com, and you can see how your state is doing, and then ask your elected representative maybe whether or not there can be some changes so that you can live more affordably, because affordability is one where people look at the price of gasoline, the price of food, and fail to realize that energy is behind all of those issues. And I might just hold up again the booklet that we produced a while back, which has the title Energy and the Environment. It came out many years ago, and primarily it came out to kind of answer many of the questions and comments, and even, as Sarah was talking about a minute ago, some of the myths that came from the Green New Deal. So I'm thinking now that I've gotten a chance to meet Isaac and also Sarah, and also we've had, of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews on the program, maybe produce another one that gets into this issue of energy, because it's a very important factor. It's the one that ultimately determines this issue of affordability, which has been kind of the buzzword during the midterms. So we talked about Alaska. We'll come back and talk about Florida with Sarah right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that next hour we're going to have our good friend Robert Knight with us. Columns that came out recently, Radical Democrats gearing up for Woke 2.0, Democrats and their liberal Greek tragedy, the difference between Woke 1.0 and 2.0, a lot of very good conversation we'll have with him. But we have, for just a few more minutes, Sarah Montalbano, and she is, again, with Always On Energy. And I thought we would move, of course, from Alaska, where you're located right now, to Florida. We have, of course, a very contentious U.S. Senate race. We have, of course, the race for governor and a number of other things. And even as you look at your chart, many people think, well, Florida would probably be like Texas and New Mexico and Arkansas and Louisiana. It would be one of the best. And it's not as good as you might imagine. So some things going on in Florida. Can you explain?
Absolutely. So hopefully you can hear me all right now. what we see going on in Florida is a really important distinction between bills and rates, because actually Florida's all sectors electricity was actually only about 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour in 2025. But because Florida is so temperate, customers are spending a lot. They're using a lot of electricity on air conditioning
Sure.
and things like that. So what happens in Florida, and it's I think the race between Donald's beating out the other Republicans in the primary, as well against the Democrat in this race, is really about where things are going to land, where it's supply. Donald really believes that we need more supply, and I would agree with that 100%. You need more small modular nuclear. You need more natural gas in order to have abundant energy supplies in order to work on this. Whereas the Democrat in this race is looking to actually cap what utilities are allowed to earn on what is called a rate of return. And that's a conversation worth having, but it also cuts against his other hopes and proposals, which of course is to add more wind and more solar to the grid. And that becomes very expensive, and you have to build so much infrastructure that ends up making very little difference if you actually cut their returns on that, just because they have to build so much. So it really is, I think, a question of where does Florida want to go at this moment? Do we want to continue to be a state that is growing and embracing that?
Well, again, that brings us into a conversation I had with Isaac, but I know that you can deal with it as well. When you say the solution is alternative sources, I'm all about providing alternative sources, but that's what they are, alternative. Solar power, you might say, well, that works pretty well because, after all, the sun is almost always shining in Florida, yet there are tremendous costs involved with that. Many of the panels are produced in China. There are certainly some concerns with that. Wind, well, again, the wind sometimes blows, but I found that a lot of people aren't real thrilled about having a wind turbine that stands 260 feet tall with 122 feet long turbine blades, not only zoom, zoom, zoom all the time, but also killing a lot of birds and bats. So, it sounds good in theory, but one of the things you've done there at Always On Energy is run the numbers and figured out some of the possible implications. And I think it's that kind of common sense evaluation that we need more of during the midterms, don't you think?
We agree completely, and we hope that candidates will start really talking about these issues thoughtfully. I think with data centers, there's such a scramble right now to be seen as the person doing something about it, and that has led across the country to a lot of policies like, we're going to put a moratorium for 1 year in New York. We're just not going to let them site here. And I think that's the wrong approach, because you really do need to be getting this dispatchable, reliable baseload sources like natural gas or nuclear or coal even, and so that you can supply these things. It would not be such a crisis right now for the politicians and for the electricity grid if we had as much excess supply as we should that is dispatchable. Because just like you said, wind and solar are not going to be able to run systems, and that is very predictable. They have their times that they go off, and battery storage just isn't able to make up the gap.
So again, these are some very important issues that we think need to be addressed. Like I said, we did produce a booklet on energy and the environment. We've had some number of guests in studio with us, including, of course, our good friend, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who has written about this a great deal. But we wanted to point you to some places where you can get some information. So first of all, one last time, we have, of course, a link to Always On Energy. And we also have a link to the Blue States high rates, and find out where your state ranks in that regard. Maybe ask some of your elected representatives, even at the statewide level, what you can do about that particular issue. So, Sarah, thank you for joining us today from Alaska, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It was my pleasure.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, like I mentioned, we're going to have our good friend Robert Knight with us. But I thought for just a minute, as we encourage you to go to the website, find some of these articles, and there are quite a few, some having to do, of course, with the issue of education, some having to do with the issue of energy. We also, of course, have our Viewpoints commentary. And my Viewpoints commentary today, and I might get some comments about that also from Robert Knight, is what I call the Tale of Two Museums. Because you have the Smithsonian Museum and the Museum of the Bible. And first of all, the Smithsonian Museum is one that is tax-funded, and so your tax dollars indirectly or even directly go to that. Museum of the Bible is funded, of course, in large part by our people at Hobby Lobby, but also through the individuals that pay to go into the museum. But the problem with that is the Smithsonian Museum, for some time, seems to really have latched on to wokeism and has really wanted to promote a left-wing culture. Now, as you may know, about a year ago, President Trump issued an executive order which was dedicated to what? Restoring truth and sanity to American history. And then more recently, you've had this 162-page report, which we do have a link if you'd like to read it for yourself, from the White House Domestic Policy Council, and it was a report on the National Museum of American History. Now, in order to maybe address that, the director of the Smithsonian went to Congress, and I would encourage you, if you have not seen it, look at the interchange, and you can go out on YouTube or a variety of other places and see the interchange between Representative Brandon Gill, who's a representative here in the state of Texas, and the director. And he starts off at one point asking if she thought politeness was a sign of white supremacy. And you might go, where did that question come from? Well, it has to do with the fact that that's exactly what's stated in some of the Smithsonian material. Of course, there's many other things that would cause you to roll your eyes, but that one, I think, got everybody's attention very quickly. And she has been on record as saying that she wants to connect research and scholarship to activism and advocacy, and really sees the programs as a prime tool of social justice. Okay, here we go. Now, at the one point, obviously, we want to tell the history. We have a history, Indian Wars. We have a history of slavery. We have a history of Jim Crow. I recognize that. But to completely camp out on that and then to ignore everything else is the problem. And one of the points that came was the fact that it's really what they've left out. There's no major exhibit dedicated to America's founding era. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the Continental Congress, the Pilgrims, or the Puritans. I think they left something out. So again, you might want to read my commentary, and we'll be back right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time really talking about the need for us to be wise, to have discernment during these midterms, and that's one of the reasons why we've posted a couple of very good pieces by Robert Knight, Radical Democrats Gearing Up for Woke 2.0, or some of the articles I have the title Woke 2.0 Coming But Don't Believe Them. Also the one Democrats and the Liberal Greek Tragedy. As you know, we have earlier in the week did talk about Robert Knight's piece, but I wanted to come back to it. Yesterday, we even had a piece by Beckett Adams saying Woke 1 wasn't just crazy, it was destructive. And we just had a few minutes ago a piece by a member of Congress, Common Sense versus Crazy. To give you an idea, this is going to be a midterm election where we're going to need to really be seeing what is there and to ask important questions. I just couldn't think of anybody better to spend some time with as our good friend Robert Knight. Individual, of course, has written for everybody from the Los Angeles Times, Heritage Foundation, but most importantly writes for the Washington Times. Individual that has been a friend of this ministry for many years. And Robert Knight, welcome back to Point of View.
Always good to be on with you, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, explain the difference. I tried to do it earlier in the week between Woke 1.0 and 2.0 because this is a distinction that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making, and I think it just illustrates the fact that we just need to recognize that they're going to be making some statements, and we shouldn't go along with what they are trying to do in terms of rewriting history. Tell us more.
Yeah, I think you just hit it on the head, rewriting history. Woke 1.0 or Woke 1, which she said was, quoting someone, was crazy, was only a few years ago. Yeah, it was. It was worse than crazy. It was very destructive.
Yes.
People lost their jobs over it. They crushed conservative opinion. They went after Christians. The whole woke world is basically a communistic worldview that will brook no other opinions. And in the service of that, they went after everything from pro-lifers to people defending marriage, people opposing men and women's sports, and anyone questioning the government's take on COVID-19. You know, now we know so much more, Kerby, about the masking and how ineffective it was, and the 6-foot distancing, which was arbitrary at best. We know about the source of the virus. It's pretty clear it came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they were working on making it stronger. And anybody who questioned any of that was deplatformed, was censored, was taken off social media. I mean, that was Woke 1.1. She's laughing it off as if it was no big deal, and she's promising Woke 2.0. And to me, Woke 2.0 is just more of the same plus more lies about Woke 1.
One of the things I thought was interesting, and this is not your column, but Beckett Adams said, you know, even to say this and rewrite history is to say, well, that just happened because of the pandemic. And then he gives us all these illustrations of Brandon Ike back in 2014 being forced out of Mozilla because he donated all of $1,000 to California's Proposition 8, or the individuals that were being pushed off campus, protested, not even allowed, lectures being canceled abruptly and ended, even some of the drag shows and some of that, long before we even had the pandemic, so you can't really make that case. So that's one of the themes that runs through your piece, which I, again, encourage people to get a copy of. We've posted it on a website, pointofview.net. But there's another part that I think is even more important, and that is, you say we should get ready to hear terms like, oh, you've just cherry-picked this, or that was taken out of context. And yet, as you point out, some of these, quote, old podcasts just happened 2 or 3 years ago, which were hardly the Bronze Age, were they?
That's the point. Yeah, they're just, especially the Senate candidate in Michigan, Abdul El Sayed. He said he was knocking football as a toxically masculine culture, part of that. And he said it was destroying Native Americans and the transatlantic slave trade, or some of the ethos of football. You know, now his campaign is saying, well, you're just cherry picking those statements. You can't put them in any context. for them to make any sense. And you can't do that with the statements by Hassan Piker, who has campaigned with Mr. El Sayed. He's campaigned with Zohran Mamdani, the socialist Islamic, communist Islamic mayor of New York. This guy's quotes are so toxic we can't share them here, Kerby.
That's right.
But they're racist. They're disgusting. They're anti-Semitic. He's full of hate, and he doesn't mind showing it. And the Democrats are fine embracing him. And I think the Republicans, if they're not completely without messaging experts, should remind everyone that this guy is right at the center of their campaigns and that the party is fine with people like him.
You know, one of the things people say is I have a pretty good memory, and I do remember some things, and one of those I remember is almost a year ago. I remember a Robert Knight saying, Kerby, you know, what's so interesting is that some of these candidates, which before used to hide their agenda, are now coming out and explicitly saying it. And, of course, you were talking about what, of course, ended up being the mayor's campaign. But since then, you had an individual who I guess is not going to be the Democratic Socialist candidate, Mrs. Hong, in terms of whether Thanksgiving is colonialist, but or even some of these other individuals that, like James Tallarico, who's running for Senate here in the state of Texas. But these are comments that are being made pretty dramatically now, and there's almost no attempt to hide them. And that is something different, don't you think?
Well, yeah, the Democratic Socialists of America are on a roll right now. They just managed to get Angie Nixon in Florida named as the Democratic
Can you
Senate
believe
candidate.
This one?
Yeah. And here's the remarkable thing. Alex Vindeman was her opponent. You might remember him.
I do.
He helped out framing President Trump for that Ukraine phone call. That was his claim to fame. But anyway, the mainstream Democrats backed Mr. Vindman. He raised more than $16 million for his campaign. And Angie Nixon raised less than $1 million, and she thumped him by 12 percentage points. I mean, this shows there's a tidal wave happening in the Democratic Party. Now, she's not going to win in November. Florida is a solidly Republican state. People love Governor DeSantis. They're not going to elect a nutcase like Angie Nixon, who has bought into the entire Democratic Socialists of America agenda, which is everything from defunding police to open borders. But the fact that the Democrats have selected her as their candidate tells you more about the Democratic Party than anything else.
It sure does. Let's take a break, and I do want to continue on with some other issues. Of course, we have the interest of the people have had about Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, but that was a Trojan horse back then. Do we have a Trojan horse now? And isn't it just amazing how, when being interviewed, many times these are individuals with the Democratic Socialist of America who are quite willing to say, yeah, that's what I'm planning to do. That's what we would like to do if we get power. So we'll come back and talk about that with Robert Knight right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Washington, D.C. has two different types of museums, the Smithsonian Museum and the Museum of the Bible. I like both museums, but the first one is looking more like an instrument of wokeism and left-wing culture. Last year, President Trump issued an executive order dedicated to restoring truth and sanity to American history. This year, the White House Domestic Policy Council issued a 162-page report on the National Museum of American History. The director appeared before Congress to respond to the report. Now, you might have seen how the representative, Brandon Gill, asked the director if she thought politeness was a sign of white supremacy, since that is stated in the Smithsonian material. She also has been promoting a different role for the museum. She wants to connect research and scholarship to activism and advocacy. She sees their programs and displays as a prime tool of social justice. The Smithsonian Museum could learn something from the Museum of the Bible, even though it is not a taxpayer-funded government museum. It begins with some foundational principles, namely that the Bible is transcendent truth. It illustrates how the Bible shaped Western culture. By contrast, the Smithsonian attempts to reinterpret history through the latest cultural and philosophical fads. Perhaps the greatest failing of the Smithsonian isn't what is said, but what is left out. A recent white paper on the museum reported that there is no major exhibit dedicated to America's founding era, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, other founding fathers, the Continental Congress, the Pilgrims, and the Puritans. The American people deserve better. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing conversation today with Robert Knight. And again, we have posted these two columns, so you can find them at our website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can go to roberthknight.com either way and find them there. Or, of course, you can go out to the Washington Times. And, Robert, for just a minute, you were talking about the case and the election in Florida. But we earlier talked about, of course, the U.S. Senate candidate there in Michigan, Abdul al-Sayed. He defeated Haley Stevens. And she, again, was backed by the Democratic institution. So we're seeing individuals who are fairly or very liberal being defeated by Democratic socialists. And this, I think, has got to be causing all sorts of indigestion to some of the Democratic leadership, don't you think?
Well, yeah, I think they're in a tough spot because if they embrace these Democratic socialist candidates, who are completely out of touch with the rest of America, that'll put the Democratic Party way out on the left-wing ledge where they don't want to jump off. If they reject them, then that'll split the party because most of the energy right now is among young people who have fallen for this socialist nonsense they learned at universities. They're all in on getting rid of capitalism. They don't even know what it means. They think it just means billionaires are running rampant all over us. And they don't look at, indoor plumbing, electricity, cars, all the things, iPhones, all the things that capitalism brought, because it's not a philosophy. It's truth in advertising. It's paying for what you want to pay for. And the buyer and the seller agree on a price, and that's freedom. And, it was Karl Marx who popularized the term capitalism to make it seem like some onerous philosophy that had to be defeated. But it's really just about people being free to do what they would do naturally.
Right. Well, and again, since we're talking about being on the edge, in your second article that we have here, you do say the only prominent Democrat to protest the takeover of the party is Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who has lamented that our party's become, and I love his line, an orgy of socialism, and called the Democratic Socialists of America members deeply anti-American and crazy. And I do have to put a smile on your face by saying, who would have thought that the conscience of the Democratic Party would be John Fetterman out of Pennsylvania? But he's really the only prominent person I can find that's making those kinds of statements. How about you?
Well, as far as public officials, yes, but you even see people like Bill Maher.
Oh, yes.
On HBO, and Bill Maher's a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. He really doesn't like the Christian right. I know that because I was on his program, Politically Incorrect, years ago. I kind of had it out with him. He was a nice guy in person, but still very left-wing. But now he's speaking out. He's saying, my goodness, the Democrats
You're
are
nuts.
like lemmings going off this left-wing cliff. Yeah, they're crazy. He said, they better wake up. But, they haven't woken up because the Democratic leadership keeps proclaiming that their party is a big tent, and there's plenty of room under that big tuff for these communists in the Democratic Socialists of America. And I don't use that word lightly,
I know.
Kerby, but when they talk about if you look at their platform, it's straight communism, taking over the means of production, abolishing the U.S. Constitution, opening the borders, free child care, free college, free housing, no way to pay for all this. I mean, I guess crazy is better than communist. I don't know.
I don't know. Well, and again, let's for just a minute answer the one question I think some people have, and that is, well, they say it, but do they really mean it? And of course, Shannon Bream with Fox News the other day interviewed the DSA national co-chair, Megan Romer, and then also an individual with the New Yorker interviewed. And in both cases, you have the co-chair of the National Democratic Socialists of America saying, oh, yeah, we're all for this, And Charles Cook points out that when you talk about to abolish the Senate is to effectively abolish the states, to abolish the Supreme Court is to abolish the rule of law, to abolish the borders and our military is to abolish our sovereignty, and to abolish the prisons is to abolish our ordered liberty, and to abolish private property is abolish our economy. When you work your way through all those lists, you recognize this is something that looks more like the example I used yesterday was Dr. Zhivago in communism. And you do use this illustration that we have in history had some examples of a Trojan horse of communism in 1917 and a Trojan horse of Islam with the Shah of Iran in 1979. So we may not be there yet, but I see the rumblings of something that we've seen before in history, don't you think?
Yeah, there have been a number of things. And of course, the original Trojan horse is the Greek soldiers hiding in the big wooden horse, and they hauled it into Troy, and then they conquered Troy that way. My point in the column is that the Democrats are hauling in their own Trojan horse right now, full of Islamists and communists. And they see them as a short-term way to win elections, but they don't see the longer-term reckoning that if either of those factions actually took over and got power in this country, they'd start eliminating their enemies. That's what these people always do, whether it's Islamists or communists, and they're not polite about it. I mean, they especially have it in for churches and Christianity, and you can see that all over the world. Wherever there are Muslim majority countries, there's no religious freedom, and there are no churches in Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours. Everybody soft pedals the threat of Islam until you see it in places like Nigeria or Pakistan or any number of countries where Christians are fearful for their lives all the time. And here we are importing it into this country.
Yes. Well, and Mark Lewis, the other day, I posted his piece on They Have No Stopping Point. He was talking primarily of communists, but it's also with Muslims as well. When you say, well, where's the natural stopping point? Well, there isn't. When you don't believe in God, then there's no absolute fixed moral code. If you don't believe in aborting babies, then why would you stop there? When you no longer feel that you have to properly define marriage, then we can change that. And so as a result, well, as soon as you start understanding that if the foundation is anti-God and anti-private property and anti-family, it doesn't bode well for a constitutional republic, and that's why I think we need to have a great deal of discernment during this midterm election, don't you think?
Well, yeah, and Christians have to get off the couch, Kerby. I mean, we've seen more Christian participation in recent elections, but it's got to go much higher. One reason Zoran Mandami, and perhaps the main reason he won in New York City, despite it having the largest Jewish population in the world, of any city, and his being anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic was that Muslim voters turned out 93%. Think about that. Of the registered Muslim voters in New York City, 93% voted. That's a pretty remarkable voting bloc, and it means you don't have to worry about majority in other ways. And they do that in places. They work as a bloc, and with small numbers, you can wield a lot of power. And Christians have to push back. They have to vote in similar large numbers. And if Christians did that, we really wouldn't have all these problems. We'd have a biblically informed government instead of a government that seems to want to undo biblical Christianity and our Judeo-Christian ethic.
Very good. We're coming to a break, and I've heard that I can keep you on for a little bit longer because two of my commentaries recently, I've, of course, always like you to talk about your commentaries, but in this case, I have one about grocery stores. What's going to happen when we start having citywide grocery stores in each one of the boroughs in New York City? I think I've got some thoughts about that. And then the other one about museums, because it does seem to me that we've got two different kinds of museums. The Smithsonian Museum, which has gone quite woke, and also the Museum of the Bible. And since those are a couple of my commentaries, I thought when we bring you back from the break, I thought I might just get a couple of comments on some things I've been writing about and we've been talking about, because ultimately that is the case. And let me just mention, for those of you that actually receive some of the material we send out in the mail, the September issue is this booklet, which is entitled A Biblical Point of View on Woke Christianity. A biblical view on woke Christianity, and you can see that some of those ideas have been in the boardroom. Of course, they've been on the campus for years. Some of them are coming out now on the campaign trail because of some of these individuals that are ordained ministers actually promoting woke Christianity. So this is another issue that we've been talking about, and I just again wanted to alert you to be watching your mailbox so that you can actually find that booklet, which is something which we provide to equip you for these midterm elections. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the last half hour, let me just mention that I wanted to keep Robert Knight on for just a few more minutes just to get his comment on a few issues. But when, especially, Robert, you were talking about Islam and the Muslim issue, I thought for a minute I would go back to a piece that first John Stonestreet and Glenn Sunshine, who I know both of them very well, did a Breakpoint commentary, and then I did it as well, because Tucker Carlson, who you know, actually had someone on the program them a while back and said, really, this conflict between Islam and Christianity is more of a recent one. There was basically a peace between Islam and Christianity for its first 500 years. And all of us that have done any studies go, what? I mean, after the death of Muhammad, you have the Muslim army moving out of Arabia. It takes all of the Holy Land, what was the Christian Byzantine Empire, conquers Spain, moves into France. If it were not for the defeat of the Muslim army at the hands of Charles Martel the Hammer, they would have taken most of Europe. Later on, they're at the very gates of Vienna. Christians who were in those conquered regions, they were dhimmis, so second-class citizens. They had to pay a jizya, a special tax. Many of these churches were demolished. And I just think it gets back to, Robert, the need to just get some history, because in some cases we even need to counter the history that comes from, quote, conservative podcasts, don't you think?
Well, some of them. In fact, Tucker, I think, is guilty of having people on who are utterly irresponsible and are soft-pedaling the dangers of Islam. And then there are people like Candace Owens, who is openly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And these people are, I think they're being useful idiots. They're allowing the other side to define what the views we should have toward Israel, toward Islam, and I think they're wrong. And I don't know what happened with Tucker, because he was so good when he was on Fox News.
Yes, he was.
He'd bring up things that the mainstream media wouldn't touch, kind of things you hear on this program. and then when he left, he was still good for a while. Now he's kind of shifted over, and I'm still scratching my head. I mean, I've encountered Tucker over the years myself, and I've always found him reasonable. And he played a crucial role when he was at Fox. Anyway, Kerby, whether it's from the right or left, I think the rising anti-Semitism is very disturbing.
Right.
And the blasé attitude toward Islam, I think Islam has to be taken seriously.
Again, I have Muslim friends. I run into them all the time when I walk, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people that honestly want to implement Sharia and fight a jihad and those kinds of things. But anyway, I was going to ask you about the grocery stores, because this one, again, is kind of interesting, because somewhere along the line there is going to be a problem for socialists, because they'll run out of other people's money, to quote Margaret Thatcher. And there now, Zohran Mamdani is wanting to put at least a city-wide grocery store in every one of the boroughs, has identified one. And yet you've first of all got to ask, why are we doing this when we have such an extensive network of food assistance? But more importantly, if he is going to be able to reduce prices by 30%, you know what's going to happen. There's going to be a black market, and people are going to go buy the groceries and then go sell them. So they're saying, well, maybe in order to prevent that, we're going to have to require people to show an ID to buy groceries. I'm not making this up. And then you can't show an ID to vote, but you have to show an ID to buy groceries. But still, there are going to be residents that might try to exploit the system. So they're going to have to, I think, limit the number of groceries any person can purchase. And you just start saying, and then, of course, after spending $70 million, they're going to go broke eventually. And it just is an illustration, again, that maybe people will have a very visible idea as to why socialism is not a good idea when they look at some of the grocery stores that are being implemented and distributed and established in some of these boroughs in New York City.
Yeah, it'd be a good lesson for the whole country, because the first thing that'll happen is it'll put for-profit grocery stores out of business.
Yes.
And that's what their point is. The socialists want everything provided by the government. Keeps people dependent, keeps them voting a certain way for the person who promises the free stuff army, more stuff. And it's very cynical. And, the same Democrats who bemoan the idea of food deserts, which are areas that don't have many grocery stores, are setting out to create more food deserts in New York City by putting the existing grocery stores out of business. This is classic Marxist economics. Center everything in the government, and then when it has its destructive effect elsewhere, then say, oh, now we need more government to pick up the pieces.
And again, they're going to spend $70 million. You're going to run out of products very quickly, so they're going to have to spend some more. But again, the goal of the stores is not to sell produce. The goals of the store is to sell socialism, and that's exactly what's going on. And I got a commentary coming out tomorrow where this is done by a liberal group. I'm pretty sure it's even located in Berkeley, where I was born, in which they point out if you compare, interestingly enough, back when there was a division between East Germany and West Germany, especially between East Berlin and West Berlin, they talk about two grocery stores 20 miles apart, one in East Berlin, one in West Berlin. The one in East Berlin only has about 3,000 items, and as a matter of fact, not very healthy items sometimes. And as a result, the people in East Berlin didn't have as much health and didn't live as long. The same grocery store in West Berlin had more than 7,000 items, and because it was competing with other grocery chains, which was probably cheaper and better food and better resources, the people lived longer and all the rest. So it's almost like a social experiment that we have seen, those of us that are older, and I just think we need to share some of that with some of the young people. But just before you go, my commentary today is about what I call the tale of two museums. I love the Museum of the Bible, and by the way, I've been a supporter of the Smithsonian Museum, but if you have been paying attention at all, you might remember when, after the White House Domestic Policy Council issued their report on the National Museum of American History, they bring in the director of the Smithsonian and Representative Brandon Gill. Remember that question? Do you think politeness is a sign of white supremacy? And she was like rolling her eyes. Well, that was in the Smithsonian material. So it does seem to me that even though we see some of these woke ideas on campus, some of those have leaked into taxpayer-funded museums, haven't they?
Oh, yeah. And it wasn't just that. It was punctuality with another white
yes,
thing.
Being on time.
And hard work. Yeah, being on time, hard work. These are white aspects that are being forced by racist people on minorities. I mean, think of how minorities feel about this. Look, I've worked hard all my life. I've raised a family, and now they're telling me I'm just a victim of white supremacy because I have these attributes I've worked so hard to develop. It's just so racist on its surface.
And one of the things I've learned from you over the years, Robert, because you have certainly looked at the issue of media bias, it's sometimes not just what they say, but what they don't say. And that report, and I'm quoting from the report, found that, quote, no major exhibit is dedicated to America's founding era, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, other founding fathers, the Continental Congress, the Pilgrims, and the Puritans. So it isn't just that they're focusing so much time on, and again, there's some dark chapters in American history, the Indian Wars, slave trade, Jim Crow, but they just completely eliminate the things that might even make you proud of being an American.
Yeah, I took my grandson last year to the Smithsonian, and he was very excited because he loves history. And we kept looking in vain for things that really were encouraging and made us proud to be Americans.
It's just amazing.
There are lots of things about labor struggles and all kinds of things. And I thought, wait a second, this isn't the Smithsonian I remember.
Yeah. Well, if nothing else, I need to let you go. I kept you a little bit longer, but if nothing else, I value your input. We, of course, post almost all of your columns and talk about it even when you're not here. And when I had a chance to keep you a few extra minutes, thank you for your graciousness. And maybe you should get combat pay for it. But or at least when you're on with Bill Maher, you deserved combat pay. I remember that interview as well. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kerby, and God bless you. And I hope people contribute to Point of View and keep you on the air, getting the truth out. Oh, it's so desperately needed. And I say that coming from a media background.
Well, again, it's great. RobertHKnight.com. Of course, we have all the links to all the other resources there, and we've posted his 2 columns. So, Robert, thank you. We're going to take a break, make a few final comments because, of course, tomorrow is our weekend edition. And boy, we have a lot to cover then. We'll see if we can get it all in. We might need one of those electronic shoehorns to get it all in. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to be talking with a couple of our guests around the round table. Holly Randall will be with us, and she's with First Liberty Institute. We'll talk about a victory for religious accommodation, and that is something that I think we should be reporting more often because of a Supreme Court decision that came down in the Groff case. We also will talk about this idea of back to school, because after all, Cal Thomas has written a piece on back to school. Of course, I quoted today from Larry Sand, Escaping the Educational Industrial Complex. So do want to mention some of those issues. And that, by the way, is the latest Outlook magazine, which maybe have already landed in your mailbox. It did in mine. Then we'll talk about a couple of the other issues that we've discussed today with our good friend Robert Knight. Leftist schemes that don't work. Charlie Cook goes into that in some detail. And Jeff Blahar also warns us, don't fall for fake polls. My goodness. These polls, in some cases, have been so far off, and good polls are certainly hard to come by. But then when some of them are deliberately used to advance an agenda, it's again important for you to not pay attention to some of those. It is hard enough for people that do this as a living and really want to do it with integrity, because again, more and more people don't have a landline. They just have a cell phone, and how to get a responsible and accurate picture is difficult enough. But some of these were deliberately faked polls, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Jeff Blahar does that in some detail. And then we're going to play a piece, or at least point you to a very good interview that Liberty did on online sports betting, because the other day I did mention this issue of gambling. And again, let me hold up our booklet on gambling that came out a while ago. And I wrote that in large part because I was convinced that we have a very significant phenomenon. A majority, anywhere from 52 to 52 to 53% of Gen Z actually see this opportunity to bet on sports as a way to get ahead financially, which is a complete disaster. But I think it illustrates only so well how many young people today are giving up on the traditional ways to support yourself. Investing, dollar cost averaging may not sound real interesting, but that's going to be a lot more helpful, especially if you get into assets that appreciate, or even assets that aren't not going to be inflated, things like gold or Bitcoin, things of that nature. There are some, and by the way, it's easier perhaps than ever to invest in some of that than ever before, and yet to instead turn your back on some wise investments and to think that maybe you could get rich quick with gambling. I think we're going to really get into that in some detail. If we have time, I do want to also talk about what is happening in Iran. We will, if not cover that on Friday, certainly cover it next week. And so those are all some topics that we will be covering tomorrow with Holly and Liberty. Let me just one more time encourage you, if you would like to know a little bit more about some of the issues we've addressed, you can certainly click on that button that says Learn More, and then it will give you information about our guest, our show materials, as well as my viewpoints, commentaries, and our Take Action. And I might just mention our Take Action is still up there, although we're probably going to move on to some other topics. But just about the time I thought, well, we'll move on, we're starting to hear everybody else on talk shows talking about flock cameras. So I thought one more time I might just mention that we do have a chance for you to contact your member of Congress, and it has to do with the Privacy Act, and that is a bill put forward by Representative Keith Self. He has a number of co-sponsors, but it would be great for your representative to be a co-sponsor as well, to recognize there are some value in these so-called flock cameras to maybe help law enforcement to track down individuals, but it also is just another layer of digital surveillance. As I've said before, one camera is a tool, 1,000, or now it's up to 1,200 cameras is digital surveillance. And some of these cities are starting to cover the cameras. Some of them are saying, well, we're going to take them down. But here's the rest of the story. Sometimes they're putting up other cameras that don't have the name Flock on them. So this is, I think, an issue that needs to be addressed. And so that's why we thought we would bring it to you, because we do have, at least ostensibly, have a Fourth Amendment protection against illegal searches and seizures. And Congressman Self said, Americans have the right to be secure in their privacy, and that just does not disappear just because we have new technology or artificial intelligence. So I thought I would mention that issue as well. And as we are talking about the midterms, one of the issues I also brought up the other day is you're going to hear more and more people talking about tax the rich. And so one of the pieces we've posted by Betsy McCoy is available. I got a commentary coming out next week on that. And you might say, well, I'm not rich, so why would I care? Well, the bottom line is, as she points out in her piece on Tax the Rich, is that we actually have seen one income tax scheme that was supposed to be temporary and only had one bracket for the very wealthy. 35 years later, it's still in effect, and now it has 7 brackets. Sometimes when they say we're going to go after the rich, they oftentimes go after the middle class as well. And she points out there are quite a few. There's the Taylor Swift tax in Rhode Island. There's the Connecticut mansion tax. I was in Connecticut the other day and Rhode Island, heard about that. We have a similar kind of tax in Washington, D.C. And our friends out in California, there's Proposition 40 that will implement a wealth tax. And so it's just worth recognizing that this is going to be one of those big issues that we're going to have to address. And so that is certainly the case. Don't forget, my commentary today is on the subject of museums. And we love the museums. Frankly, I love the Smithsonian Museum, but I love the comment by Robert Knight. Take his grandson there, loves history. You're trying to find any exhibit that you can feel proud about. I mean, there are a few, but I think there is a need to kind of bring some of that back to sanity. We need some common sense. We need common sense on the campus. We need common sense in these museums. We need common sense in the boardrooms of major corporations. We need common sense out there in the campaign, which is one of the reasons why we're talking about this issue of woke Christianity, which is sort of made its way out there into the campaign trail, and the need for us to think about that as well. And as I was mentioning when we were talking about the grocery stores, I'll just give you a preview. My commentary tomorrow is on socialism and the Berlin Wall. It is unfortunate, but a lot of young people have never grown up around the Iron Curtain, grown up around this idea of a divided country. And in some respects, you had almost a perfect social experiment, because when Germany was divided between East Germany and West Germany, they also divided Berlin. But the people in East Berlin realized they could just walk over to West Berlin, and then they would eventually be able to travel to West Germany. And so, of course, they put up a wall. And that then provided, if you will, a social experiment between the tale of 2 grocery stores, one in East Berlin, one in West Berlin. And the difference in the products, in the difference in terms of the quality, and the difference in terms of the health and lifestyle of the individuals was dramatic. And I think just illustrates again, if you needed any history, if you needed any examples, here's one more example that we can certainly cite as well. So lots of great resources available on our website at pointofview.net. I hope that you'll also click on that button that says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. Give now, because we certainly do depend upon your financial support. Most importantly, I want to say thank you to Megan, but usually it's thank you to Megan Henderson, who had car problem, I believe, so it's Megan Kitchen. And isn't it great to have both Megans here to actually, and Megan, thank you for stepping in and helping out. Derek, thank you for producing this program. Enjoy your day. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.